Hi, everyone. Welcome to Journalism Futures, The Fight Ahead, hosted by the Freelance Solidarity Project and the National Writers Union. I'm going to give it just a minute or two to let folks filter in, and then we'll get started. Hey, hi again, and welcome to Journalism Futures, The Fight Ahead. Just a heads up, we've disabled video and muted mics so that everyone can focus on our speakers tonight. We're so thrilled to have all of you here. My name is Abigail Higgins, and I'm the co-chair of the Freelance Solidarity Project, which is the digital media division of the National Writers Union, the host of tonight's event. Just some really quick background on us. The Freelance Solidarity Project was started in 2018 when a group of freelance media workers were excited by the wave of unionizations across the industry and started asking each other how they could support these efforts and also advocate for freelancer-specific protections. FSP quickly decided to make a home at the National Writers Union, a more established union that has been fighting for freelance writers since 1981. Today, we are fighting together, not just as writers, but as editors, illustrators, podcasters, photographers, and all the other workers that make journalism happen. We're working collectively to improve conditions in the industry by fighting for legislative change, pay transparency, basic and public minimum working conditions for freelancers, and a variety of other initiatives that we're hoping will change the face of journalism, including hosting events like tonight. We're delighted to have had a huge turnout for this event, but not for the reason I imagine many of you showed up tonight, which is that you're very, very worried about the state of journalism. If that describes you, then I cannot encourage you enough to start organizing. If you are a freelancer, if you've ever freelanced, or if you're invested in the conditions of freelancers, which should describe everyone in the industry and everyone with a stake in this industry, I encourage you to join us in this fight. The media crisis we're currently facing could spell the end of the industry, or we could take the future into our own hands and finally create an industry that genuinely serves workers and readers, not billionaires or corporate executives. So with that, I'm going to pass things off to our moderator, Kate Harloe, who is a member of the Freelance Solidarity Project and the National Writers Union, and an independent journalist whose work has appeared in Mother Jones Magazine, The Drift, Neiman Lab, and elsewhere. She's a member of the new cooperative publication Flaming Hydra and an author of the Media Quake column published at Popula. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks so much, Abby. And hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion on Journalism Futures, The Fight Ahead. I'm Kate Harloe, and I'm really excited to hear tonight from three people whose work in organizing I so admire. I'm going to start by quickly introducing the panel and the panelists, and then we can dive in because we have a lot of ground to cover in a short time. So the idea for this panel grew out of the acute moment of crisis we've been experiencing in the journalism industry over the past several months. In January alone, over 500 journalists were laid off. This follows 2023, which was the worst year to date for digital media in terms of job cuts. Whenever the crisis feels like it cannot get worse, it somehow does. But also, many of us who have been in the field for a while know that the journalism industry has been collapsing for a long time. So we wanted to convene this panel in part to talk about how we got here. The structural breakdown of the journalism industry did not happen overnight. What happened? But we also want to spend a lot of time talking about what we do now. What does it look like to grow our organizing efforts to meet this moment? What are the most important fights to be engaged in, and how do we think about them? How do we build bigger and better coalitions? If our current media system is failing pretty dramatically, what would a new and better media system look like? There are a lot of answers, and these are really big questions. And this conversation will in part be a broad one, but we also want to talk in particular about the role of media policy. All of these panelists here tonight have advocated for ideas, whether they involve public funding or antitrust action or government regulation, that broadly fall under the umbrella of media policy. And this is a moment where, as more and more people are seeing media policy as one way to organize for systemic change in the journalism industry, it feels like an important time to talk about the lay of the land, what sorts of policies are on the table or already underway. This won't be the only thing we talk about, but hope to at least touch on this as one piece of the organizing ahead for us. Ultimately, the Freelance Solidarity Project wanted to put this panel together because we think there is reason to have hope against all odds. So we want to make sure this conversation is not just about how bad things have become, even though they're really bad, but also on the possibilities before us. So toward that end, we have three brilliant panelists here to offer us insight and maybe some hope tonight. We have Victor Pickard. Victor, maybe if you want to wave in your Zoom window, who is the C. Edwin Baker Professor of Media Policy and Political Economy at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication, where he co-directs the Media Inequality and Change Center. He has authored or edited 6 books, including America's Battle for Media Democracy and Democracy Without Journalism, Confronting the Misinformation Society. Brandi Collins-Dexter is here as well. I see her waving. Brandi is the Schuster Media and Technology Fellow at Harvard Shorenstein Center and a Media Fellow at the National Center on Race and Digital Justice. She is also the author of the fantastic book, cannot recommend enough, Black Skinhead: Reflections on Blackness and Our Political Future. As former senior campaign director at Color of Change, she led several campaigns for corporate and government accountability in Silicon Valley. And finally, we have Matt Pearce, who is the president of Media Guild of the West, a rapidly growing local union of the News Guild CWA that represents journalists in 13 digital and print newsrooms across Southern California, Arizona, and Texas. On behalf of the Guild, he has served as a policy advocate on numerous pieces of legislation affecting journalist safety and the media economy. Thank you all so much for being here and welcome. I want to start with some questions for each one of you, and then we'll have some open discussion time among the group. And we're planning to reserve about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A for questions from the audience. So if you're in the audience right now and you'd like to ask a question to the panelists, set it in the Q&A box, and we will make sure we get to as many as we can toward the end of this conversation. Okay, I think that concludes my my spiel. So to start and dive in, I first want to turn to Victor to give us some historical context for where we are today. Victor, I'd love if you could start by talking a little bit about how we got here, no small question, and why the structural breakdown of the media system has become so severe. In particular, I think, and we've talked about this before, but many rightly name Google and Facebook or big tech as major culprits in the collapse of journalism. But you've often pointed out that the roots of this crisis that we're experiencing go back much earlier than that. So could you take us back to some of the roots of this breakdown and, how did we reach what you've often said is the market failure of journalism?
Sure, I will do that. Thank you, Kate. I first want to thank you and the Freelance Solidarity Project for organizing this very timely panel. And I'm so honored to be here with Brandi and Matt, and also grateful that the audience has turned out this evening for, it won't just be doom and gloom. I do think we'll have some hope mixed into the narrative as well. So to answer your question, I'm going to try to cover about 200 years of journalism history in about 2 minutes. So I'll talk very quickly in very broad strokes. But most historical narratives that try to explain how we got here tend to begin with the rise of the internet. that the internet killed journalism, that the internet explains these mass layoffs and systemic market failure. Certainly the internet was a major development and played a major role in this saga. But I think to understand the root cause of today's crisis, we really need to go back to the 80s, to the 1880s, to get a sense of when things originally started going awry, or at least when we saw this kind of structural transformation that happened unevenly. It took many years, but generally speaking, this is when you saw what had been a fairly mixed business model for newspapers. So some ads, some reader support, significant support from the government, actually not well known, but in the form of postal and printing subsidies. And then there was also support directly from the dominant political parties at the time. Hence, this is often referred to as the partisan press era. But gradually, publishers realized that they could make a ton of money through advertising. And whereas before, roughly speaking, before the Civil War, you might have seen somewhere around 10% of their revenues coming from advertising, according to some measures. By the 1880s, it was up to 40%. The turn of the century, up to over 50%. By the early 1900s, over 70%. So a very dramatic transformation where the newspaper industry became so dependent on advertising revenue. And as this became the dominant model, newspapers became much more monopolistic. But where before you might have seen competing dailies and major newspapers, going into the 1900s, you increasingly saw the rise of one newspaper towns. This is when the newspaper industry became radically commercialized. It became very profit-driven. This is when you see pathologies like what was then called yellow journalism. Today we would call it clickbait. And then throughout the 20th century, you also see the rise of newspaper chains as publishing became a very big business and highly profitable for a relatively small number of newspaper owners, investors, and advertisers. So generally, this is a story of capitalist logics taking over the entire newspaper industry. And then when the internet came along, newspapers suddenly lost their monopoly status. So whereas before, if you wanted to sell furniture or clothes, or you wanted to reach an audience, you had to go to your local newspaper to buy an ad, to pay an inflated price for advertising space. But then once readers and advertisers migrated to the web, this monopolistic position was blown to bits. First, you had Craigslist single-handedly wipe out the classified ads. Then you had the platforms come in and take much of what's left. So ultimately, the advertising dominant revenue model that operated for over 150 years or so is not coming back. It will never support journalism again to the extent that it once did. And I think based on this analysis, it's safe to say that there really is no commercial future for the local journalism that we need as a democratic society. I think we're going to have to find something radically different, something better than before. So that was my long-winded historical synopsis. I left out a few details.
That really was not, that was incredibly succinct for 200 years. So congratulations on fitting 200 years into, I think that was only 4 minutes.
I'm
Victor,
trying to get it down to like 2 minutes. So I gotta work on this.
You're so close. You're so close. Before I leave you, Victor, I just want to quickly ask one follow-up, which I think may be self-explanatory based on what you just said, but could you just say a little bit about, you've been a big advocate for public funding for journalism and thinking about journalism as a public good. So in 1 minute, could you please share a little bit about why you think that is critical for for a future media system?
Sure. So I really see the public media model as the last best hope, especially for local journalism. And maybe we'll get into this more in the discussion, but there's often this knee-jerk hostility to publicly supporting journalism. And as you said, journalism is a public good. The fact that it was profitable for so long sort of camouflaged that public good quality to it, but really journalism has never paid for itself. Before, advertising was essentially a kind of subsidy for it. And so we really have to find a way to support it. I do look to our already existing public infrastructures, whether we're talking about still the postal system. We've got post offices all across the country. We've got a public broadcasting system. So we could think about leveraging, radically restructuring, democratizing those systems, but also funding them properly. Right now, we're almost literally off the chart for how little we pay towards our public broadcasting system in global comparison. So that's something that we can return to later. But I do, if we just move up to those standards, like we pay about $1.58 at the federal level for our public broadcasting. The Brits pay about $100 per person per year. Nordic countries even more. If we can just get up to global norms, we could actually have a very vibrant, robust public media system.
Thanks, Victor. That's really, really helpful for kind of setting the historical groundwork for our conversation. Brandi, I wanted to turn to you next to talk a bit about regulation as another response. There's public funding as one response to this breakdown. And you yourself have been an outspoken advocate for antitrust action. You've also been an advocate for government regulation of private investment funds, which in recent decades have played a really big role in the destruction of newsrooms. So I wanted to ask you about these forms of regulation as a response to the collapse of journalism. What role does antitrust action play? And likewise, what role could government regulation of private investment funds play when it comes to this crisis?
Yes, thank you for having me. And I want to keep us in history just a touch longer before we move forward, but I'm going to bring us up about 100 years and start with the 1980s and 90s. Again, as Victor said, oftentimes there's this public narrative that the internet happened and that sort of drastically changed everything. But there's a few more layers that I want to uplift to that kind of inform my work. And that goes up to kind of the buildup of Reaganomics in the 1980s and the Clinton era deregulatory responses in the 90s that continued into the millennium. So in the 1990s, we saw the Telecommunications Act, which deregulated the communications industry. And you saw the rise of these massive mergers. Disney purchased Capital Cities and ABC. You saw AOL merge with Time Warner and the biggest media internet merger of all time. You see the rise of Tribune Publishing as this juggernaut, and vertical integration in broadcasting and content production began in force. And this is coupled with the Taxpayer Relief Act of '97, which reduced several federal taxes in the United States and fueled the rise of venture capital. And that was coupled with the spread of the World Wide Web and collided to create a saturation of these kind of .com startups not built to last. The consolidation of those companies in the aftermath and the failure of the FTC to regulate an onslaught of tech mergers would directly lead to what we see as the now new tech gilded age with Amazon.com, eBay, and Google YouTube at the helm. And this shift all kind of help change how we access, consume, and understand information. At the same time, you have the failure of the FCC to regulate to account for media diversity, which led to more media consolidation, the rise of Sinclair Broadcasting, and a new landscape, that news and information landscape that's global in scale, but has these cascading effects that profoundly fall on the local level. So part of what we're seeing that I think requires multi-level kind of regulation and interventions is this sort of Sharknado effect of consolidated media with increased profit-driven models, shifts in consumer behavior that's often guided by what they have easy access to and not just what they want to consume. Mass layoffs of journalists then create a deficit in terms of being able to do more engaging stories. And what we're left with is a lot of aggregated content, opinion pieces, and online broadcasters that hold a role of public sense making. And while that matters, that can't be all of that there is, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about private investment funds, which include private equity, venture capital, hedge funds, and leveraged buyouts. Often what takes place is a firm acquires an entity and infuses it with a significant amount of capital, including borrowed money. And the entity, not the investment firm, takes on the debt accumulated and has to pay interest on it, potentially creating a debt trap. Part of what we saw more recently with Vice is that when Vice filed for bankruptcy in 2023, they recorded a staggering debt of $834 million. Media companies like Vice and others are increasingly pressured to accept a devil's deal with private interests to meet a variety of needs. But the future of media requires the government to rein in these firms and hedge funds, assert regulatory accountability for senior executives engaging in misconduct, and it requires public funding that can sustain a diverse media environment. And so it's really important for us to think not just, I think there's some great policy out there. Wisconsin has a bill on the table around saving journalism that I know my colleagues at Free Press support. But I think, we have to really look at how are we dealing with the curse of bigness? How are we ensuring that overinflated private equity funds and get to private investment firms get to come in, dismantle things, take things over, lay off mass amounts of staff, and really hurt not just journalists, the economy of information, but the way we operate and move as a society and are able to engage in our democracy. And I feel like I didn't do as good a job as Victor managing my time, so I'll pause there.
You did great. You did great. That was like, I mean, I'm giving you pretty challenging questions and you're keeping your decades long answers to 3 to 4 minutes. So that was perfect, Brandi. Thank you so much. I'll go to Matt next, but this is just the beginning and then we'll kind of crack this open for conversation amongst us all. Matt, I want to turn to you for to talk a bit about the perspective of the working journalist. You were a journalist at the LA Times for, I think, close to 12 years. Was it 11 years, 12 years?
Almost 12 years. I just took a buyout, so I am I am free.
And you're, as I said in the introduction, you are president of the Media Guild of the West, which represents hundreds of working journalists. And you've been an advocate for many of the things that we've already touched on in this conversation. In particular, you've been an advocate for working journalists getting involved in media policy organizing. So just to start there, I think we covered some ground here of just like how we got here, things are bad, a bit of a buffet of some ideas for options, but I wondered if you could start by talking a bit about why you think it's important for working journalists to get involved and organized around media policy specifically.
Well, that is a really great question. I did want to say first, thank you so much to our sisters, brothers, and kin of the Freelance Solidarity Project and the National Writers Union. You all do such amazing work, and I just want to thank you for convening this amazing group of speakers for basically probably the most important subject we could be talking about right now with the loss of a large number of journalism jobs. So I have sort of learned a lot in my 6 years of forming a union at the LA Times, to starting our garage band union local, to blinking and falling asleep and waking up and suddenly representing, like, I don't know, a ton of people who do journalism across the Southwest border, including 7 newsrooms in Texas, which is crazy. Like, there's a real workers movement out there that I don't think we have seen in journalism since the 1930s. And so to take things back maybe only a century, I mean, I think that God, there's so much wrong from with the business, and Brandi has touched on this, and there's been so much wrong with the business, which Victor has touched on going back. But like, also through that area, I do want to tell a slight counter story, which is that in reaction to the commercial pressures that, Capital had put on newsrooms and newspaper barons had put on newsrooms, there has been like a legacy of newsroom organizing, both within the context of labor unions, but also if you think about things like the old progressive movement, journalists who wanted to find ways to do journalism, trying to escape the pressures of commercial mandates. And so, this would be the old conversation about objectivity or how to report facts or whatever, which looks a little bit different today. But the story that I tell is that through this entire period, we have had a working class of journalists in this country, including in journalism schools. And we don't really think of it as a working class, but it is a labor tradition of journalists who have been fighting for themselves and fighting for the work that they do, and fighting for ways to do it within the constraints that we've faced throughout this entire period of time. And so since you've seen the collapse of the business model, my members work for a lot of those former regional monopolies that Victor described, and they are now living through the Sharknado of problems that Brandi described. We're suffering from it all, and we see that manifesting in hundreds of journalists losing their jobs, many of my coworkers, because of the failure of those regional monopolies, but also the drifting away of audiences who used to have local journalism bundled into this, nice product that didn't quite serve everybody, but had a happy side effect of investigating the government and doing a bunch of other beneficial journalism in the meantime. So the main point that I make is that our union has now grown in a lot of density and has become kind of a little bit of a threat to the publishers in California in particular, because we've gotten big enough, because we've gotten dense enough, and kind of because we've gotten really tenacious and we're going out on strike, and we'll get nasty when we decide to get nasty. We are sort of a check on a lot of the legislative activity that they would do out here, which means they have to play nicer with us. And they are very busy in the state house, and they're very busy in a lot of state houses. And my number one point that I want to try to convey to any journalist who is listening to this and thinking about public policy is like, if you're just thinking about getting into public policy, your bosses have been in the public policy business for like the last century. Like, you need to catch up. Because they are very busy up there in your state house. They're deciding the rules of the game for you, and it's time to get organized and do something about it.
Beautifully said, Matt. Thank you for that. I couldn't agree more. And I feel like that actually sets us up really nicely for what I was thinking we could chat about next, which is media policy broadly. So a bunch of big questions incoming, but I think that media policy can mean a lot of different things. And I think especially for journalists who maybe haven't been deeply involved in media policy, it might be helpful to just sort of start by talking about the lay of the land a little bit. There's a lot going on. And to your point, Matt, like in this moment in particular, there has been a lot going on. There's a lot underway. People have been active. We need to catch up in our organizing. So I wanted to ask you all, put this question to the group. Since the landscape of possible policies is pretty vast, I'm thinking of things including what you've touched on, from antitrust action to civic media funds, public funding, tax credits, digital ad taxes. I mean, there are a lot of policies under discussion right now. I'm curious, amongst this group, everyone brings kind of a different perspective here. What are some of the most important policy opportunities or fights that each of you has your particular eyes on that you think is really important at the moment? And anyone can jump in first here. I think, Matt, you raised your hand.
I wanted to make sure I didn't interrupt someone. So it's like popping right now, especially in more liberal states, or democratic states. I will just say that like there's a ton of interest in journalism policy within the Democratic Party, and a little bit less in the Republican Party, but not a complete absence of interest. There's multiple buckets. There's a sort of bargaining code bucket. This is the stuff that happened in Australia and Canada, where basically the government comes in and threatens the big tech companies, Meta and Google, and says you need to pay for journalism. And then it tries to bring a lot of pressure to bear to force big tech companies to basically pay cash to publishers in exchange for scraping our labor without compensation. So that's one bucket. Another bucket that's new that like might be happening out here in California. Senator Steve Glazer has talked about the concept of a platform tax of some kind. Whether that's a digital advertising tax, which some people have promoted, which is, I think Maryland has tried that out. That's been tied up in the courts for the last 4 years. But you could also do something like a kind of barter tax. It's like you find other ways for taxing tech companies for taking people's personal data in exchange for using their services, and then using that to fund things that would combat the negative externalities that those companies bring to the public, which are extensive. I worked on a bill a couple of years ago that would basically set up like a state grant program. New Jersey has a model for this. The New Jersey, I think it's the Civic Media Information Consortium. My apologies if I mangled the name. California talked about a version of that. California has also tried, it's funded a fellowship program run through the University of Berkeley that basically pays early career journalists and employs them and then deposits them in community newsrooms around the state to report on journalism. So that's a form of using public funds to support journalism. We could freaking fund like the corporation for public broadcasting for once. That would be nice.
Things to say about that.
There's infrastructure there, and I'm actually wandering into Victor's territory, so I'll yield the mic.
Victor and Brandi, I'm curious about your thoughts on that question of the most important policy opportunities or fights that each of you is hopeful about, has an eye on, even idealistic about.
Okay, I'll jump in really quickly. And some of it's just to reiterate what Matt just said, that at the state level, there's a lot of exciting developments. I think we've already mentioned Wisconsin, Illinois is looking at a package of bills. DC passed, or at least was discussed. I don't know if it's gone into effect yet, this local media voucher plan, which is really interesting. So I think there are these direct subsidy models at the state level that we can't pass at the federal level yet, that hopefully at some point we can scale them up, or at least it broadens our imagination for what government can do. It serves as a kind of proof of concept. But at the same time, I do think we need to think more aspirationally about what we could do with policy. I do like Matt's idea of a platform tax. That's something that has been advocated for a number of years in various guises as kind of an alternative to the JCPA, which is maybe something we'll wonk out a bit on later in the discussion. So I do think I've been resorting to this very wonky phrase of non-reformist media reforms, but basically this idea that we should evaluate, or at least try to make policy interventions that don't just shore up the current failing commercial model, but it's also trying to transition and transform our commercial model into nonprofit or at least low profit model. So that's kind of a framework that I'd like for us to use more often in how we're evaluating. Like, does it democratize? Does it decommercialize? Does it devolve ownership and control to the local level? I feel like that's what policy should be doing more of.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. I love the idea of, taxing targeted ads to fund civic-minded journalism, particularly with Facebook and Google and a lot of these different companies, and looking at the proceeds going to support local news, startups and sustain investigative projects. The bill in Wisconsin would create a Wisconsin Civic Information Consortium, sorry, I'm losing my words today, that would oversee a grant program to support local journalism and media projects. And there's some interesting stuff in there as well. And again, I think there's these two ideas. It's like, how do we think about a sustainable media system, and how do we think visionary about what that can look like, and how we support journalism and investigative journalism? And it's like, how do we deal with the bleeding? And that's where some of the things like something like this, re-upping and passing the Stop Wall Street Looting Act can come into play. That's where using antitrust authorities to block bloated private equity firms from acquiring newspapers and breaking them down can come in. And I think those two things really have to couple together. And one thing that I want to just kind of like double down with on what Matt said is that, I've been in enough rooms at Congress, FCC, FTC. I've been in rooms with Sheryl Sandberg and all sorts of folks. And people's bosses are definitely there. They're definitely bringing in coalitions of, diverse media groups to try to muddy the water. Oftentimes you'll see legislation that uses a similar aspiration name, but it's not actually, doing a thing to sustain journalism. So really looking into who's behind that bill, where's the money coming from in that bill, talking to your unions and groups like Free Press and other, media groups to really get an idea before you throw your weight behind something, because this stuff can get really weedy and we can end up with a bill that, is kind of like looks good from afar and is really messy up close.
I think that's a really great point, Brandi. I'm tempted. There's so many different directions I want to go that it's hard to choose. Part of what you said, Brandi, raises for me the question of coalition building. And I did want to ask you all a question about what's going to be necessary to develop and win policies that benefit not only working journalists, but regular people whose access to news and information has been severely affected by this crisis. So very interested in the coalition building question. But maybe before we go there, as Victor mentioned, maybe it's time to wonk out just briefly. It is a conversation about policy after all, or in part, media policy. And I do feel like, especially in this group, I'm really interested to get a little concrete and talk about one policy as an example of this, the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, which Victor mentioned. Matt, your union has supported the California state version of this bill, which is maybe conflating a couple things because there's a national JCPA is the acronym, and there's also a sort of a California state version that grew out of the JCPA, but is a little different as I understand it. This policy has been a little bit polarizing. I know Victor has advocated against the national version. But Matt, I thought it would be helpful if you could talk us through the California state version and what you think this legislation does, who it benefits, why you think it could help. And then maybe Victor, we could have your thoughts on that as well.
So that's a great question because I mean, this is really polarizing legislation. If you look at the coalitions of people who are in support of it and in opposition to it, it's like the weirdest bunch of people on each side. And so I actually try to be like pretty gentle with everybody when talking about this policy, just because everybody is like everywhere on it. To me, the basic concept is countervalence. And I should say that, like, his background, this concept comes from the big publishers themselves. It was actually Rupert Murdoch's sort of media empire in Australia that said, like, wait a second, what the fuck? We were supposed to be the big guys in town, and like Meta and Google are like walking all over us. And so they came up with this concept that, you know, here they are trying to compete in the digital advertising market, which still, you know, brings in a bunch of revenues that still support journalism presently, though a dwindling share. And they're like, we don't have the kind of bargaining power that we would want to have against these massive tech companies that aren't even American. And I think it's actually significant that this policy first developed outside of the American context, both in Australia and Canada, and now a bunch of other European countries. And so the basic concept, and it takes on various guises, is basically giving more leverage, either the ability for publishers to collectively bargain with the duopoly, as it's sometimes called. In California, since you can't do antitrust policy at the state level, the concept is to basically you know, set up an arbitration mechanism for publishers to go to Google and say, like, hey, this is the value that you're extracting from our journalism for free and not paying for. You need to pay up, or we'll take you to arbitration. And arbitrator could award us, you know, God knows what amount of money. So this is polarizing because obviously the companies that stand to most significantly benefit are the same sorts of companies that my union has been unionizing against and screaming at and going on strike against, including, like, you know, yesterday, Austin, our Gannett unit was on strike during the eclipse against Gannett. We just had an open-ended strike against Gannett and Desert and Palm Springs. And so it's just, these are awful companies that tend to benefit from it. But the problem is that, and this is the part where I get polarizing, like, these are still the companies that employ the predominant share of journalists, especially journalists doing local journalism. And the reason why I've sort of come to the conclusion that, you know, at least giving them more bargaining power in this limited context with big tech companies is that, like, we're talking about companies that can fucking shut off journalism on the internet when they feel like it. And they do. And they threaten democratically elected governments that are seeking to regulate them and said, we're going to ban journalism in your country if you dare tell us that we're going to have to pay up for featuring this content. And, like, that to me is an absolute menace. And it makes me want to crash a freaking pickup truck into the front of the bank. So after Meta threatened to do that in the United States, and it still has, I think if Congress passes that policy, you know, our guild decided to start just like taking a more serious look at this type of legislation. And in California, at least, because the publishers had been writing the rules of the game up until this point, like, there wasn't any requirement that any of the money that they were getting out of this legislation all around the world was actually going to go to journalists or to newsrooms. It, like, could just go straight to boardrooms, which is what happens now. And so in California, we negotiated in language that requires 70% of it be spent on payroll. And obviously, since money is fungible, you have to know or have some kind of disclosure just to see if these companies are behaving like you think they might or might not. And so we also negotiated in some, I don't know, relatively punitive disclosure requirements for news companies to tell their own workers exactly how much money they're getting from tech companies and whether they're going to get a raise or not. And then they also have to like publicly disclose this information in a way that I think would create one of the most useful data sets for establishing the health of journalism in California in case we're going to do future journalism policy, as we must. So for a lot of different reasons and too many to really like get super deep into it here without monopolizing the conversation, we've moved into a support position on the local bill because we brought the publishers to the bargaining table. And, you know, that one is currently in the Senate and could make it to Newsom's desk. There could be other legislation popping up in California that could also be really interesting. But basically, I mean, I think the time has come for the tech platforms to pay up and basically pay for the damage that they've done to local journalism in some form or another. It's just a matter of exactly what that's going to look like. And I think just as critically, and this is the part that's also controversial, like, as the president of a union, like I am both idealistic, but I'm also working with what I've got. And so, you know, when I'm lobbying and advocating and doing coalition building and trying to find friends to work on policy with, you know, I kind of work with what I've got because you know, like you can't slay capitalism in a single piece of legislation. You need it from every direction.
So nice. That's a great phrase, slay capitalism in a single piece of legislation. Victor and Brandi, I saw both of you like nodding throughout that. I really want to invite your thoughts on this question in particular, or anything that it brought up for you in regards to beyond JCPA, but interested in thoughts on JCPA as well.
Go you first, Brandi.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think I would love to hear what Victor says, not to pump, but I think it is extremely important that the unions are, you know, at the table negotiating this. The devil is always in the details. And I know part of what concerns me, especially about the national bill, is that part of what it's offering is this kind of trickle down approach that I think is likely to lock in pre-existing power dynamics and relationships. I think automatically, maybe it's my, you know, whatever anti-corporate chops or whatever, like whenever you see the folks that you just named, like, you know, Gannett, Alden Global Capital, you know, all of these folks at the table saying this bill is great. I'm kind of like, is this bill great? And I think that like it's really, you know, without that antitrust component, you know, without this ability to rein in these corporations, I think that continued threat, that ability to say to a country, we will pull our stuff and go home, like that, you know, that's the thing that really needs to be challenged. And so I think for me, I'm interested in seeing like what kind of things are we setting up on, you know, the national regulatory legal level that can really ensure that we don't kind of fall once again for sort of the trickle down economics game, because I have yet to see that really work in practice, even though it sounds good. I'd again love to hear from Victor.
Thanks, Brandi. I agree with everything you just said, especially the metaphor of the trickle down is sort of I think one of the more generous things you can say about the JCPA in particular, that we can hope that some of that money would go to actual journalists doing actual journalism. But going back to what Matt said, I also agree that we should be gentle in this debate because many people I deeply admire and like Matt, support these kinds of bargaining code measures, and I totally understand why they would do so. The only part of the critique I would add to what Brandi already said is that it's sort of like the broader discourse around it, that often many proponents of these bills treat them as almost like a silver bullet, and it really misdiagnoses the problem, suggesting that the platforms are the core root of the problem, when if the platforms were to disappear tomorrow, it's not as if all that advertising revenue would simply go back to the to the news publishers. So to go back to that idea of the platform tax, I think that would be a brilliant alternative, because then we could tax the platforms to put money into a public media trust that could then be redistributed back to areas of greatest need, back to the news deserts, to communities of color and poor areas that have never been well served by the commercial system. And I think, that would be much better than going to the Murdochs and Sinclair Broadcasting and the people who were complicit but themselves in worsening the journalism crisis. So there are alternatives, and we should rein in the platforms too. I agree with you, Matt. That needs to be a priority as well.
I do want to say, by the way, I completely agree that, like, even though I support this legislation, I in no way believe that it is somehow a miracle cure or the silver bullet that's going to cure everything. And so even in my advocacy for this stuff, like, I never try to pretend that, like, we can't also be doing everything else at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Matt. Yes, I'm just noticing we're getting close to Q&A time. I want to see if I can squeeze in one kind of final question here before we move to Q&A, which of course is going to be a huge question. But on the point of coalition building and toward our goal of some hope here, I wanted to ask, I think each one of you has been involved in really impressive organizing or documenting and creating the historical record of organizing that has happened. And I wanted to take a minute to ask about victories and examples of times that journalists and other workers have worked together, won important policies, won important battles, or other measures. In part to show that it is possible that, like, when we organize, we can win things. And also because I think one hurdle we have here in this organizing is convincing journalists that they can organize and take a stand for something, which, Matt, you've been really vocal about over many years, is that journalism is activism. Actually, you're inherently taking a stand for something. But I think the JCPA bill is in some ways a great example of how tricky and delicate coalition building can be. And I think it's helpful to talk about examples of times when we've organized and won something big. And with each of you, I had different things in mind. And again, I know we need to kind of move to Q&A here. But I just really wanted to ask this question. Matt, you've organized a major newsroom. So there's that. Brandi, you've done a ton of organizing in the media justice movement, which is really critical, organizing people who aren't just journalists, but people who are affected by all of these things and who need to understand how these things affect them. And Victor, you've written about a lot of different movements over many, as you said, centuries. And I was thinking of a couple of examples actually before this, but anyway, anyone who wants to tackle that giant question before we move to Q&A, I would love to hear thoughts on examples of victories, reasons to build coalitions, have hope that we can win.
I would do one that's actually outside of the sort of economic context, but
Sure.
a few years ago in 2021, actually in Los Angeles, we had a bunch of different journalism groups that banded together. It was my guild, it was the Society of Professional Journalists, it was the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, the Asian American Journalists Association, the National Association of Black Journalists, and the local press club. And we really went after a piece of legislation in California where we discovered that California state law basically provided no ability for journalists to report on public protest when the police declare like a riot or a public disturbance. State law gives them dramatic power to sort of sweep away and arrest everyone, including journalists. And there was actually a piece of legislation that was gonna make that actually, or curtail the limited rights that we already had and made them like a little bit worse. And so we had many journalists down here who had either gotten detained or otherwise, assaulted or hit by rubber bullets by police after 2020. And, we worked together and turned that bill around and made it something that actually expressly put into state law that journalists have the right to stay and observe and report on closures that happen in public spaces when protests are happening, First Amendment activity. Police very often come in and often illegally suppress those protests. I think it would be nice if we had a sort of recognition of the abilities, the public's ability to gather in public and peaceably demonstrate. Sometimes that hasn't always played out that way. So we managed to work together and get a win at the State House, and that was kind of our entree into it. And that was one of the places where, when you can find common ground with other groups that are kind of interested but not activated, like you can start building power with the other groups that are kind of in the space. And I will say that, like, my lesson there was that actually, like, an enormous amount of what you're able to accomplish, especially at the state and local level, is really dependent on relationships. Like, do you have relationships with the other people who are doing the work in the state that you're working in, locally? Like, do you have a level of trust where you kind of know where each other stand and you're able to work together and find some common ground? Because it's incredibly challenging to do this stuff if you don't have organization in your own group, let alone if you're not kind of have a working relationship with other groups who are working in the space. Like that to me is a material precondition of actually making change happen. I'm very much in favor of organizing. I think mobilizing, which are just sort of assembling random people, is much more challenging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Matt. Brandi and Victor, before we turn to Q&A, I'm curious about your thoughts on that question as well.
There are so many fun experiments and movements and initiatives that I would love to get into. In rapid fire, there's a great one that Matt actually just recently wrote about, the Los Angeles Municipal News, which is a municipal newspaper in LA, and I think it was 1912, that was publicly funded. But also, Matt mentioned this earlier, the rise of what was then called the Newspaper Guild in the 30s and 40s was just, a very feisty, militant organization that wasn't only trying to improve working conditions, but also had this very radical vision for society and for democracy and the role of journalism in a democratic society. And I think, more recently, I would point to like the independent media movement, the independent media centers of the late 1990s, early 2000s, of kind of a grassroots people's newsroom that I think if we could just find a way to publicly fund, we could have one of those in every community across the country. So many others to point out. Those are just a few that come to mind.
Thanks, Victor.
Yeah, I mean, my mind is all over the place. I mean, it's no small thing. I really want to big up Matt and you guys and all the work that you're doing around unionizing workplaces. I think that is an important win. My husband is at the Marshall Project on the business side, and they just recently unionized at 85% on both sides, both the newsroom and business side. And like that energy, I think, has been really crucial. I think some of the wins that also come up for me are, kind of wins around net neutrality. That was a really sort of powerful moment where you had news guilds, journalists, like all hands on deck, really talking about these issues of, internet and media and information in an interesting intersectional way. There were wins, a couple of years ago around low power FM stations and building those in communities, some of which are still in existence and were really crucial during COVID and getting information out in different languages to different communities. And then quickly, I think of also, maybe not traditional journalists, but around the writer's strike and the conversation around the role of AI and the ability of, corporations to be able to write or create something with AI and then contract with people in regressive ways that would have had deeper implications around labor and creative content. I think some of those wins and lessons are ones that I think we can build off of in these other spaces as well.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad I asked that question because I actually don't feel despair hearing that for one moment. Well, I want to make sure we have time to get to Q&A here. We have reached about that time. Actually, we're a little past the time when I should have turned to Q&A. And Roshan, who I think, yes, I can see him. I don't know if everyone else will be able to, but he's waving. Roshan is also a member of the Freelance Solidarity Project and has been sort of managing the Q&A box as all of these questions come in. So I'll turn things over to you, Roshan, to ask some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, I'm Roshan Abraham with Freelance Solidarity Project. I'm gonna try to combine some questions in an effort to just sort of like do a basic vibe check of what people are asking. So the first question is about journalism and labor rights. That's something that's come up in a few different ways. One person asks, how should we understand worker protections in a barely surviving but ultimately capitalist industry where all these sorts of like where wage equity and mental health support are both prerequisites for successful media businesses and are being overlooked. And a few people asked about being a journalist and also being an organizer. One person said, I don't have a labor background. How do I get more involved and make a transition into being an organizer as a journalist? Another person is asking about, what can we do to organize safety and well-being of journalists and freelancers in any future funding models. And one last question I'm going to sweep into that is, a lot of us don't know the labor history of journalism. So how can we learn more about that? So that's kind of like the big smorgasbord of labor-related questions that there's a lot to chew on. But that's for everyone. So whoever wants to go first. Or we can just take some time to meditate on it. I mean, if it helps to kind of like digest the questions into bites, I think just to like start with, in terms of like people organizing now or forming unions now in this like really precarious moment where it feels like all of these companies are claiming they don't have any money, what leverage do we have as workers? That's one question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, some like everything that I would say about the labor context is that it's it's like similar to journalism and reporting itself. Like every single labor circumstance is fact specific and often different and distinct from each other. Like where I worked, the LA Times, it was like massively underwater and probably still is. Like the billionaire owner, and like we love yelling at billionaires, but like the reality is that he has been deeply subsidizing the newsroom for 4 or 5 years, and that's good. Like that means we're doing a wealth transfer from a billionaire to journalists. It would be great if he keeps going. The reality and the conclusion that I came to is that that's an inherently unstable relationship. And when he decides to cut back, as he has, to lose less money, that means that an enormous amount of people suffer. So to me, it's like looking at the business model and trying to figure out how to help fix the business model, or find a business model on the policy level is necessary to help have material conditions that allow you to have a stable job. I will say that like a lot of people have started looking at the nonprofit newsroom movement, which is really interesting and promising. Sometimes they have better working conditions than the commercial newsrooms, but a lot of times they don't. 4 of the 5 last newsrooms to join my local and organize were nonprofits. So like I'm here to tell you that like working at a nonprofit newsroom is not a journalism paradise. Those folks are organizing as well, and you're dealing with capital still, just in a sort of new form, because the people who are funding your newsroom are philanthropists, and we're talking about where people are spending the profits that they've made off of other more productive industries and that they've elected to spend on journalism. And that comes with all sorts of issues, both in terms of like even securing that funding. Like the unit in my local that's on strike right now, the Long Beach Post, is a nonprofit newsroom. It converted from a commercial, like private equity owned newsroom to a nonprofit in December. feel good, it's great, you know, we're going to do a community-oriented organization. Well, the philanthropy that they were counting on apparently didn't appear. And, you know, now they've are facing extraordinary cutbacks and union busting, and most of them have been laid off, but they're still on the picket line. So even just rolling over into a nonprofit status, you are still dealing with money. You are still dealing with like wealthy people who are making choices about you and about your work. And you still have to organize to cope with that. And I will say also that like, even when you do, and even if it's a pretty simpatico environment, like you are still facing a lot of the same economic problems that a commercial newsroom is. You've just like removed some of the revenue sources that would traditionally fund a commercial newsroom if you're giving up on like advertising. So I'm just saying that like I am like someone who is promoting policy to help roll over into nonprofit status. I want to help people boot up cooperatives where journalists are their own bosses, but like you still need money to do this stuff. And that's the part where it gets incredibly hard still if we're not dealing with some of the bigger picture economic issues and the questions of political economy.
If Victor and Brandi want to add anything, want to give you the table, or we could move to the next question. So one question about race, kind of and the issue of recreating some of the same issues in the media ecosystem. One person asked, in communities of color that rarely seem to benefit from the efforts of traditional, i.e. white-led democracy or journalism, how are panelists incorporating racial equity into their policy work, specifically around Black media reparations? And this person also mentioned that some nonprofits that have hired people from legacy outlets have perpetuated white supremacist beliefs as they've come over into the nonprofit world. So in terms of thinking about race and policy and not just recreating the same sort of deep racial issues that our legacy news media has had pretty much since the founding of this country, how are we addressing that with policy?
Yeah, I can jump in there. As the resident Black person that wrote a book called Black Skinhead. I think this is an important piece of the conversation, right? Like this is an interesting panel because usually I lead with naming that the crisis of journalism is one that has always existed for, marginalized communities and people sort of left outside of dominant culture and dominant resources. Like one person asked about, books or background on labor organizing and history. And one that I would definitely mention is News for All the People by Joe Torres, and the Media 2070 project, which focuses on media reparations and really moving this conversation around like, how do we talk about the future of journalism and news without a bold vision for what that looks like through a lens of equity. And even when it comes to initiatives like, Press Forward and others, they're important in terms of like, moving money into the field, but foundations like MacArthur and others, they're talking about 500 million, and you're talking about like billions plus dollars being generated by sort of private equity. So that's, kind of a drop in the bucket, right? There's a little bit of moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic, but I think this is why, to me, it's profoundly important to be involved in issues of antitrust, because there is a stake in that in terms of like community owned and controlled media and what's possible there and what are the different fights that can be taken on the labor and business level that really, shift the calculus. And right now, unfortunately, when I go up to have those conversations, I see like a lot of white men and not enough, of other folks. So I would love to see that. And I know we're at time, so I'll like stop there, but I'd love to talk to whoever raised that because I have a lot to say.
Can I do a quick couple of book plugs on journalism union books? I ran away to go find them off my shelf. So History of the News Guild, a union of individuals, which kind of describes the dynamic very well, which is that it's fucking hard to organize journalists because everybody's very independent minded. And so we're living some of this today. Also, there's this other history, Walter Brash, with Just Cause, unionization of the American journalist. And as Brandi was talking, it just reminded me of a not journalism union book, but this great labor history. So talking about racial justice, not just in newsrooms, but in the organized labor movement, Organized Labor and the Black Worker by Philip Foner. So speaking of all the like racism of mainstream newsrooms over the past century, that was also true of the labor movement as well. It's good to know the history to not recreate those patterns. So form caucuses, support your colleagues forming caucuses in your unions, build power for your coworkers. It shouldn't just be me, a white guy, doing all the time.
Roshan, what do you think? I know we're at about time. I saw a question from an organizer. Maybe one more question.
Yeah,
There's-
we could do one more question. Let's see, we could go to co-ops. In the spirit of public media trust, what kinds of structures, entities can we build that secure an alternative while the system fails around us? Can you speak about cooperatives too? So if anyone wants to weigh in on cooperatives and other models like that.
Cooperatives, very supportive. The challenge is you may need some capital to get going. Like, how are you going to pay yourself? It's very hard to run off small dollars. There is like good newsletter infrastructure that's out there. 404 Media, I think, booted up with some former writers from Ghost or from Vice using Ghost. That's good. But also, if you're organized as a cooperative, you might be organized as a for-profit, which means it's harder to get some of that philanthropic grant money. So I will say, be gentle with cooperatives in advocating for nonprofit media, because a lot of them are organized as worker-owned businesses and not just worker-managed businesses.
Yeah, if I could just jump in on that, totally agree with what Matt said. In my ideal utopian vision, we would have publicly financed, worker-owned co-ops as our public media centers across the country. And that would at least get at part of the democratization problem, as well as the decommercializing it. But I also think we can have structural diversity, we can have a variety of forms. But I also agree with what Brandi was saying earlier, that the nonprofit model I think is a sign of hope, and it's something we can be excited about, but it is not a systemic fix. So we are going to have to try to find an entirely new model. And I've been increasingly studying the history of the public education system, which was very controversial in this country when it was established. But the proponents for it were very clear that unless you wanted to allow only rich children to have a quality education, there's going to have to be a public education system. And I think there's a parallel here, that if we want other than rich communities to have access to the local news media that they need, we're going to have to come up with a public system. And it's going to be a long, long struggle, but I think we have to at least put that on our horizon now.
Thank you, Victor, Matt, and Brandi. I honestly hate to do this because I could just keep going, and there's so many questions I didn't get to. It's almost painful that we didn't get to them, but we are at time. So I do want to respect your time, of course, and everyone here, and make sure that you have an opportunity to leave if you would like to do that. I'll just conclude us really quickly and say a couple words. Really just want to say thank you to everyone who joined us tonight for this conversation about the fight ahead. We really hope this is going to be the first of many. There were so many questions, like I said, I couldn't get to, just me, and I know there's so many questions in this chat, and that people asked before the event, during the event, and that all of your remarks have raised for me. So we really are going to keep doing this, and the struggle continues and will be a long road. So it is incumbent that we keep doing this. there are a lot of ways to get involved in this work. If you've attended this event and it sounds like this is something you'd be interested in getting involved in, please do reach out. I think perhaps Abby or Elena can drop a link for our sign up for one-on-ones to learn more about the Freelance Solidarity Project in the chat. But we're everywhere. You might expect us on Twitter and Instagram, and we have a website. So, and, you know, reach out to any one of us as well if you have questions. And I think that's it, even though it feels like there's so much we didn't cover. But thank you so much to Brandi, to Matt, and to Victor for joining us tonight. I also want to give a special thank you to Mitra Kaboli and Roshan Abraham, who was just on video before, for all the work they put into organizing this event behind the scenes. A lot of labor it takes to pull these things off. Also want to thank co-chairs of the Freelance Solidarity Project, Abigail Higgins and Olivia Schwob, as well as our communications manager, Elena Novak, for all of their hard work as well. And that's it. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Kate. This is wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.